I want to talk to you about the pivotal verse in the pivotal chapter of the pivotal book of the New Testament. And I'm glad to be able to slow down a little bit. When I record the minute-long things that I release every day, I've been rushed to get them in, and so I have to remind myself when I get to this one, where we're going to take 10 to 15 minutes, that I can slow down and should slow down. But I'm very eager to talk to you about that this morning as I record this, because it's just such a fascinating topic. So when I say the pivotal book of the New Testament, I'm talking about the book of Acts. That's the short term for it. It's the longer term is the Acts of the Apostles. And it's actually it tells more about what goes on with Peter and Paul than it does the rest of the apostles. But it is the pivotal, I call it the pivotal book of the New Testament. And to give you a sense of why, it links the first part of the New Testament with the rest of the New Testament. First part of the New Testament are the Gospels. There are 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then then comes the book of Acts. And after the book of Acts comes the epistles, also called just letters. Epistle just means a formal letter. So there's 4 Gospels. There's 22 epistles. Even the book of Revelation is an epistle. If you read it, it's an epistle that went to 7 different churches. And it was like a circular letter that went to all of them. But there was a little message to each individual church, so it was personalized for them. So the book of Revelation is a very unique letter. None of the other letters in the New Testament are like it. There are parts of the Old Testament, the book of Daniel and the book of Ezekiel, which are sort of like the book of Revelation, but no other letters like it. So you got the 4 Gospels, 22 epistles, and then you've got the book of Acts, for a total of 27 books in the New Testament. And the book of Acts is pivotal because it's the only one of its kind. There are 4 Gospels, there are 22 epistles, but there's only one book of Acts. And the 4 Gospels, of course, give the history of Jesus, or the biography, if you will, of his ministry life. That's primarily what it covers. It's not written like a biography that covers his childhood. It just says very little about his childhood. But it does bear witness to what happened when he was an adult and ministering. He left his work of carpentry. And that's mainly because the men that wrote it were with him, were the apostles, and that's what they saw and heard. They didn't grow up, none of them grew up with Jesus. And so they wrote based on what they saw and heard. And every one of them ends with the resurrection of Jesus from the dead on the 3rd day after he had been crucified and killed, murdered. So the epistles are all written by apostles to the congregations that were formed of people who believed in this message of Jesus. But the book of Acts in the middle, this bridge, explains how the apostles saw his life and then preached it in a way that created these congregations. People wanted to hear more, and they didn't have any books to hand out. There was no New Testament. And in terms of Old Testament, that was kept on scrolls in synagogues and in the temple, and they couldn't be hauling those kind of things around. They're very expensive. They couldn't pass them out. So everything was by word of mouth. And what little they had in writing was like these letters that went out, and then the Gospels. But even they weren't there in the very beginning. So the book of Acts just tells a fascinating story of how the facts recorded in the Gospels resulted in all this life change, because just the Gospels by themselves wouldn't necessarily explain how all that happened. So the book of Acts is clearly the pivotal book in the New Testament. And I don't want to say it's the most important book, because all the books in it are important. It's like the human body. I mean, which part of your body do you want to do without? Can I cut off a finger? No, I don't think you want that. You want every part of your body, and we want every part of the New Testament. So what is the pivotal chapter in that book? Well, it happens to be the second chapter. And you'll see why as I explain more and more about it. But Acts chapter 2, there's 28 chapters in all. By the way, those four Gospels comprise about 40 to 45% of the New Testament. The epistles also comprise about 40 to 45%. So that 10 to 15% in the middle is the book of Acts. So it really sort of is the center of the book. And as I said, it has 28 chapters. And then the most pivotal chapter is chapter 2, because that's the first chapter where the gospel or the good news about Jesus is preached. In other words, that's the first place where the material of the four Gospels is put together and then presented as something people could respond to, something people should respond to. We should respond to Jesus' life. It meant something. Surely what he taught we should hear and we should practice. But there's even more to it than that, because we should respond to what his life meant, to what it means to our future. It means that we have a life after life on this earth. It means that we will live forever. Just so many things that go with that gospel, that good news of Jesus Christ. And this second chapter contains that, where it was first preached. And the author is Luke, the same one who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And he records for us that it was Peter who preached this first sermon. And it was on what the Jews call the day of Pentecost, or at least what we today call the day of Pentecost. It was a Jewish feast. And Peter gets up and teaches, and there's a lot going on here. The people are speaking in languages that they did not learn, did not themselves understand. It was like the Tower of Babel in reverse. If you can imagine being there at the Tower of Babel, recorded in the book of Genesis, if you were there, everybody's talking the same language, everybody understands each other, and then the next thing you know, everybody's speaking in different languages. They can't understand each other, and so they just go their separate ways. Well, here it's the exact opposite. All these Jews had come to Jerusalem, which was the capital of Israel, and they've come to celebrate this feast, and people start talking in all different kind of languages that they didn't understand. It was a miraculous event. It was obviously a work of God to call attention to the apostles, because they were going to explain what was going on. And then Peter preaches this amazing, I don't know if sermon is the right word, speech. He proclaims the gospel. But what makes this so fascinating is that just a few weeks before, and this is about month and a half after Jesus had been raised from the dead. And you probably know the story of Peter, that on the night Jesus was betrayed by Judas Iscariot and was arrested, the disciples all became very afraid, and Peter, who was the most prominent among them, he himself became very afraid, and he didn't want to admit that he knew Jesus when he was there in Jerusalem, because he was afraid they'd arrest him. And he was very disillusioned at the time too, because he and all the other apostles wanted to fight to defend Jesus. And when they came to arrest him, Peter even cut off a guy's ear. He took a sword and just whacked off the guy's ear. But Jesus rebuked him and said, you shouldn't have done that, and then heals the man's ear. And then Jesus gets arrested. And Peter is just dumbfounded by this. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't, he'd seen Jesus perform miracle after miracle. He knew that why should he go silently? He expected Jesus to become the king of Israel, like his ancestor, like Jesus' ancestor David had been. And those men all expected to fight for him. They thought they were like David's mighty men. So he's confused, and then he gets rebuked by Jesus when he tries to defend him. What's going on there? So Peter's just very, very disoriented. And I'm not trying to, fully excuse what Peter did. But on the other hand, I just don't think any of us should be too judgmental of him, given what we might have done in the same place. And we need to be understanding of the situation he was facing. But he folded up that night. He was of no use at all, because he was just trying, he didn't want to get it. He wanted to find out what happened to Jesus. That's why he was sticking around. But he didn't know what to do. And so he was just trying to lay low until he could find out what to do. And after Jesus was raised from the dead, Jesus had an encounter with him, and they sort of indirectly talked about this incident, and Peter was able to make things right. But Jesus then stayed with the apostles for the next 40 days, and he appeared to them at various times and places. And during that time, he taught them what the Old Testament had to say about his life and what it all meant. Now, all through the Gospels, we can read where the apostles were confused. They didn't understand what Jesus was talking about a lot of the time, but they couldn't deny the miracles, and they couldn't deny the reasonableness and the power of his teaching. But they still were very, very confused about what it all meant. He told them before he was going to die several times that he was going to be crucified and be raised from the dead. And they didn't understand that. They just had no conception of it, that he would rise from the dead. We take it for granted now because we live 2,000 years after the fact. We've been hearing about it for that long. But Peter didn't understand it, just like the rest of them. But Jesus was very kind and gentle, and he restored Peter, and he showed him that he wasn't going to throw Peter away just because he had made that mistake. And then Jesus is teaching all of them, including Peter, about himself in the Old Testament. So what happens on this day of Pentecost is that Peter starts teaching out of what Jesus had taught them during those 40 days. And so whereas the night before Jesus was crucified, Peter was like, I don't know nothing. I don't know. I don't know him. But on the day of Pentecost, which was about 50 days later, roughly 7 weeks, all of a sudden he's saying, this is what this means. And I realized that I'm going to have to do this thing in 2 parts, because I can't just rush through what Peter did. So we'll call this part 1, and then next week I will go through in Acts chapter 2 what makes chapter 2 makes it the pivotal pivotal chapter of the book of Acts, and then the specific verse in this chapter that is the pivotal verse in this chapter. And it's just amazing. You will, if you don't already, you will love and admire Peter as much as I do. And even more importantly, we'll both just be reinforced in our understanding of what God did for us through Jesus Christ, and how the words of Peter on this very, very special day just opened our eyes to that. God bless you.